Thank you, Tigis. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Welcome to this overview on Performance Standard 3, that is on resource efficiency and pollution prevention. The Performance Standard 3 covered three big areas, the resource efficiency, greenhouse gases, and pollution prevention. And we will go on detail on these three topics, but first we will provide an overarching principles of this performance standard. Performance Standard 3 is to be implemented or observed together with Performance Standard 1, which indicates or guides towards the assessment and management of environmental and social risks and impacts, and guide clients to implement any measure under an environmental and social management system. So always looking Performance Standard 3 together with PS1 will be important to ensure that all the project cycles are covered, that there is a continuous improvement, identification of risks, mitigation measures, monitoring, and feedback to the loop. So now, along with these three main topics, the objectives of Performance Standard 3, what it looks to achieve is to protect the human health and the environment. How? By avoiding and minimizing project-related pollution, promoting more efficient use of resources, sustainability here, including energy, water, but also raw materials and other fuels. And finally, Performance Standard 3 looks to reduce project-related greenhouse gas emissions. So this is really what the Performance Standard 3 aims to achieve. And now the how with some principles, and then going in detail, providing some guidance on how to achieve these objectives. So critical to all PSs is the application of the risk mitigation hierarchy, meaning that is always trying to anticipate or avoid risk and impacts. So that's the first line of thinking. Then moving to minimization or mitigation measures. And as a last resource, compensate or offset. Now, other principles that are important for Performance Standard 3 is the application of good international industry practice. And in the next slides, I will discuss more about what it means. But it implies that projects are to be seen from the perspective of technically and financially feasibility, identifying what are the principles and techniques that are more adequate for this project in this context. Now, sometimes the good international industry practice, such as the environmental health and safety guidelines, have a different value than the country where the project is being hosted. So when there is a discrepancy or a difference between the local regulation and the EHS guidelines, the clients are expected to achieve the more stringent one. The next principle is about where the risks and impacts are considered and is across all the project life cycle. So it's not only in the current status on operations or construction, but it's since the inception or conception of the project, thinking about how to avoid, minimize, or manage the risks and impacts. It includes the design, the operations, maintenance of the project, and even the commissioning, and thinking about what are the future expansions of the project. So taking all this holistic approach will be very important to manage the risks and impacts of the project. And finally, Performance Standard 3 put the project within a context, meaning it's not only about the physical boundary of the project, but it looks at where that project is located. What is the capacity of the environment, the accessibility capacity that is already, maybe could be already degraded airshed. And you have the same project with the same technology in two different locations. And that will have a different impact on what is the capacity of that environment to receive more pollutants. Or maybe it's a land pollution issue. So looking at the project within the context and looking if there are sensitive receptors. Maybe here there is a nearby community or there is a nearby sensitive biodiversity area. And here, for example, is where you link this performance standard with performance standard 6 or performance standard 5 about key communities. So they all tend to be interlinked in a way. Now, let's discuss more about what good international industry practice means. in the context of PS3, is not talking about the latest and the best technology available, but it's really trying to identify what is the most appropriate technology for this project in these circumstances. And it's not trying to shortcut or skip the achievement of the objectives of performance standard 3, but it's trying to achieve them in a way that is technical and financially feasible. Because we want to be sustained over time. We don't just want the best solution right now that cannot be maintained maybe in 2 or 3 years or 10 years. So good international industry practice refer to the professional skills, diligence, technology that are adequate for the project in the circumstances, as I mentioned before, taking into account the local legislation, the environment, the current situation. And financial feasibility is considered also, and it's not only that you take a look at the cost right now, but also the maintenance, the long-term cost. I can implement the best technology, but maybe it's very expensive to maintain and operate. And we have seen this kind of projects where they cannot be really implemented or effectively prevent pollution because is not possible to maintain to cost. So taking into account all these elements will really guide success in the future of the project. Now, one source of good international practice is the World Bank Group Environmental Health and Safety Guidelines, which are critical for the implementation of Performance Standard 3. The World Bank Group Environmental Health and Safety Guidelines are technical reference documents that provide performance levels and measures that are usually acceptable for the World Bank Group and are considered good international industry practices. Currently, the World Bank Group has 63 EHS guidelines, one general EHS guideline that usually is applicable to most projects, and then 62 sector guidelines. The sector guidelines provide sector-specific good practice, but also values for discharge, for benchmark on energy, on water, and effluents. And they are available in our website, and they are available also in different languages. Now, the World Bank update them occasionally, especially when there is a change in technology or in good international industry practice or a new sector is emerging. For example, in 2015, there was the release of the wind energy environmental health and safety guideline. Recently, we have updated a couple of agribusiness sector guidelines, and we are expecting to release very soon the cement and lime manufacturing environmental health and safety guideline. It is important to get familiar with the guidelines and apply them in the correct way, meaning understanding what is the applicability of those parameters. Now, at the beginning, I mentioned that Performance Standard 3 covered 3 big areas. The first of them, resource efficiency. So now I'm going to go and talk more about what are the requirements on resource efficiency and the Performance Standard 3. And it refers to an analysis and measures to cover resources that are used mostly in the business activities, in the core business activities. And it's not only energy or water, it also includes raw materials and fuels. And the core business activities is an important characteristic or focus that the performance standard provides. So let's say the client is a chemical fertilizer company that has a significant use of resources, but maybe the client has focused their efforts in the building and lighting and illumination and has changed all the lamps to LED lighting. Although it's a positive impact and a positive initiative, it will not really provide sufficient benefits or effects for the nature of the project. So really taking account what are the core business activities would be important and what are the solutions that are technically and financially feasible to be implemented in order to reduce consumption. Another principle or another guidance here on resource efficiency is the implementation or the integration of cleaner production principles into the design and processes. And nowadays, cleaner production is very well understood, and there are great examples available about implementation of cleaner production. That it guides us to look at different parts of the process or even the design of the product per se. And nowadays, there is a great tendency to talk about circular economy and to review and go back and take a look on the product itself, the design of the product, and that will benefit also the use of the resources. Cleaner production principles include review the technology that is used, review procedures, maybe the layout of how the process is managed, reuse, recycling. All these are principles that can be considered. Long-term maintenance and operation of the plants or companies. This will also yield benefits in terms of resource efficiency. So guiding us to really look at all aspects on the design and processes to integrate these principles. Lastly, resource efficiency on the performance standard 3 also guide the client to monitor, identify key performance indicators, to be able to benchmark or compare yourself or the client with other similar projects. First, yourself with over time, but also with other projects, and then to know how the project is in relation with the good international industry practice to be able to manage, monitor, and address the differences if there are. Now, on Performance Standard 3, there is a specific section on water consumption, of course, given the importance of the resource. And it focuses on what is called the significant consumers of water. And this is relative to what is the impact of the extraction of the use of the water to other users. And again, here, very close link to Performance Standard 1, where the client is guided to identify and be able to know, to understand what is the demand and the use of the resource. And identify that there is no adverse impacts on others. And here again, you have maybe the same agribusiness project with the same technology in two different locations. In one, there is water stress and there are significant potential users of water, will be very different than the same project in another location where the resource is not scarce. So the performance standard guide clients to analyze, identify what is the water availability and what are the options for this project, even alternative location of project. And then what are the options for conservation? What are the options for, are there other water supplies? And a last resource again, water consumption offsets. And any measure that is implemented on water consumption should follow good international industry practice. And the World Bank Group Environmental Health and Safety Guidelines offer some benchmarks and information about how to go or how to compare the values. Now, we want to bring to you also what we have learned in our experience at IFC in the implementation of Performance Standard 3 on resource efficiency. And after this slide, we will go to questions and answers. But what we have learned about the implementation of Performance Standard 3, or what we have seen, first is that the clients tend to focus only on energy and sometimes only on the electricity use and not really looking at all the resources. And there is little attention sometimes to raw materials and fields where there can be significant gains on resource efficiency. Another thing that we notice is that this very goes straightforward to mitigation. So yeah, these are the impacts, and then here we are, this is what we are going to do to reduce and solve. But there is not enough thinking about avoidance. Can we really avoid the use of the resource? And especially in intensive sectors, a lot of efficiency can come with the change or modification of the resource. And this is also very much used when we have hazardous materials. There is a lot of alternatives, and thinking about how can I avoid maybe the use of the resource will be the first thing, avoidance before minimization. Performance Standard 3 asks for alternatives, also aligned with Performance Standard 1. But sometimes the alternatives that client presents are not comprehensive. So they tend to be like a light touch. Oh, maybe we look at this option, but no, it's not really good, or it's not cost effective only. So alternatives analysis should be more detailed, comprehensive, include data, good analysis that will really allow people to make a good decision on whether this is the best resource or the best place to put the project. There's also a significant issues with baseline assessment and initial information. And again, here I'm referring sometimes to water, and there is not enough data or analysis of what is the availability of water or what are the options for this project. And sometimes they are not done early enough that allow the decisions to be made based on those information, on those baseline data. Sometimes we see that the project is seen in isolation and not really considering other users. And maybe, for example, here you might have a hotel and you think, oh, well, a hotel in this island or this small area, yeah, there is a little bit of water stress, but a hotel is a small consumer, relative is fine. But when you take an outlook and see, oh, but the tourist agency is looking to implement or to develop 10 more hotels in this area, then there is a different impact. And then you have to account other users. And here, back to Performance Standard 1 on analysis of cumulative impact assessments and all the competing users. Lastly, benchmark is also sometimes problematic in terms of sometimes it's not comprehensive, the measurement of the use of the resource, and sometimes it's compared in the wrong way. So for example, in this table, we have put here from the EHS guideline on pulp and paper, the benchmark for energy and water consumption. And yes, you have to get how much water you have consumed, how many tons of product you use. But in addition, you also need to understand what is the technology or the mill type that you have to be able to use the proper benchmark. So understanding all the elements of the benchmark is critically important. So with this, I will stop here for questions and answers on this topic. Tigis?
So there's a note here. I find it difficult to apply this standard, climate mitigation finance, when considering projects that reduce GHG resulting from industrial process improvements / cleaner production. In these cases, is there a reference benchmark of GHG reduction to say this project can be considered as a climate finance?
We will talk more about the greenhouse gas emissions and the implications for the projects, but there is an important difference between what the Performance Standard 3 is trying to achieve in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and specific finance products that qualify the project for a certain type of finance mechanism. Mandar, I don't know if you want to come in and
No, precisely. That's exactly what we'll be discussing about this briefly in the next few slides and next few minutes. But you are absolutely right. PS3 has a little different objective, and a particular climate finance product or climate finance project has specific requirements and specific standards and benchmarks. So let's talk more, and then if there are any more questions, we can again come back to this at the end of the session, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you. Here, is there any international standard for color coding for the waste bins, or is it only as per national regulation? What if the national regulation is silent on this?
Mandar, would you like to address that?
Yeah, we will take it again. We'll talk a bit about the specific requirements for, let's say, waste handling, waste management, waste storage in some of the next slides. But broadly, again, PS3 does not go to that very specific level of requirements. However, as Adriana mentioned, we have these 62 sector-specific guidelines, and those guidelines actually 63, but 62 sector-specific. Those guidelines actually present a little more granular sector-specific guidance. General EHS guidelines also give some more color to it, but broadly, yes, it is the national standard that will guide on this. If the national standard is silent, and if our EHS guidelines are so not very clear or very granular about it, but let's say if you're talking about labeling of hazardous waste in a healthcare facility, then there are sometimes other standards like JCI or such, or if there's another hazardous waste, where we can look at other international standards like PESEL Convention or such, industry-specific standards also. So let's again come back to it a little more in our next segment, and then if some more questions we can talk at the end.
Great. Adriana, at which moment of the project the benchmark take place?
Well, I would say you can design the project to consider the benchmark. So since the very beginning, you can start thinking what I want to achieve with this project. So in the design, you have to incorporate the design. Now, to start benchmarking, you need to be obviously mostly on operations and collecting all the data. Usually a couple of weeks or after the project is really working, you can start managing the benchmark. But my encourage is to go early into the design and think about how to put the project to achieve these targets. The benchmark is very critical also that you set up system and mechanisms to monitor. So if you want to monitor water, it's not maybe the total water of the factory that you want to monitor, but you will want to install metrics or measurements, meters across different parts of the sector of the factory to identify where the high consumption of water is. So that's a good practice there. Thank you.
Okay, let's take one more, and then we'll go to Mandar. The last question: how to deal with ESIA that do not provide enough information on resource use? The person is saying they have dealt with this constantly. ESIAs that do not estimate resource.
Yeah, in here is usually we require an additional supplemental study on the resource. It has to be, again, depending where the stage of the project is right now. But usually if we are early, we go back to the client and require, you need a supplemental analysis of the use of the resource. You have forgotten about this and that. And if it's just a little bit too late already in the implementation, then retroactively we ask them to, right now, based on what you have now, what measures can be implemented. But as always, early is the best, and supplemental studies will always be required in these cases. Thank you. Then we move to the next session.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Mandar, over to you.
Sure, thanks, Adriana. So as Adriana mentioned earlier, the first, the PS3 has three important topics. One is resource efficiency, and the other two are greenhouse gases and pollution prevention. So we'll try to cover these two in next few minutes. It's going to be a challenge because there's so much packed in this, and we'll try to cover as much ground as possible. Speaking about greenhouse gases, I think the timing for this session is so perfect. As you all know, this Sunday, the COP26 is starting, and climate change is again on the global radar like never before. So PS3 is the performance standard, is the only performance standard that actually tries to address or tries to look at this greenhouse gas emission climate change issue, that provides us the tool to handle it. So what PS3 requires is, as you can see here, is expect the clients to consider technically and financially feasible and cost-effective options to reduce the project-related greenhouse gas emissions. So you can look at the location, you can adopt the energy sources, try to go for renewable or low carbon energy sources, adoption of low greenhouse gas emission technologies, and also reduction of fugitive emissions, particularly refrigerants, which actually the leakage from the refrigerant systems may lead to very potent emissions of greenhouse gases. In addition, I mean, this is as a principle, try to adopt as technically and financially feasible, cost-effective options. In practice, also, there is a clear requirement of calculating Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. At the beginning of the project, at the design stage, you estimate it and then keep monitoring annually, especially if your project is exceeding 25,000 tons per annum GHG emissions. To do so, one has to use the internationally recognized methodologies, those promoted by UNFCCC and other international good practices. And also it is important to document these GHG impacts in the ESI. It's not only calculating the GHG emissions, but if there are any other climate-related impact assessments have to be included, and to the extent possible, identify mitigation measures. The PS3 does not have any specific requirement to follow this technology or reduce this much, 10%, 20%, 50%. As a first step, PS3 requires the clients to, the companies to calculate, to estimate the GHG emissions and keep monitoring. It's a simple principle is what gets measured gets managed. So measuring is the first step. Of course, the target is to increase resource efficiency, reduce GHG emissions, and it will bring the positive benefits, in terms of cost reduction. You save on energy costs. You also save on, you're aligned more to the future targets to be ready for, future country targets, national targets on GHG emissions. Also, many countries have these emission trading schemes. You can benefit from that. And most importantly, as we saw in the question earlier, you can have access to climate finance. Now, what would be the specific requirements, how much reduction? It all depends on which program you are trying to access the finance from, what are the specific sectoral targets and sectoral benchmarks and so on. But the PS3 actually starts the process by monitoring and keep on, trying to go for continual improvement in that. And again, as Adriana mentioned earlier, everything that we do under PS3 also has a link to PS1 in terms of impact assessments and so on. So as I mentioned earlier, the preventive approach is expected. It's not only monitoring, but then going forward, you have to try to prevent GHG emissions to the extent possible. We have to assess these climate change risks under PS1. Now, I think one key factor that we have seen is one of the issues that we have seen is how do we define GHG coming from the project? And how do we define the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions to be calculated as a project? If you are looking at one facility of a large conglomerate, then the project is defined as the footprint of this facility. Scope 1 emissions are those coming from this physical footprint of the facility. Scope 2 emissions are the electricity or electricity indirect emissions for this facility. A client or a sponsor could have 10 such facilities, but we are focusing on project level GHG emissions. So that's an important distinction one has to understand. The other issue we see is that sometimes the methodology or the emission factors that are used to estimate GHG are not aligned with GIIT. They may not be the latest emission factors. So it is quite important to make sure that we are following the correct emission factors, correct methodologies. And then the guidance note 20 for the performance standard. Actually, I should remind you, the performance standard is performance standard, but we also have guidance notes that supplement the performance standard that gives a lot more nuances, a lot more explanations to the specific performance standard requirements. Now, this guidance note 20, which refers to this performance standard 3 clauses 7 and 8, which talk about greenhouse gases, have actually a number of greenhouse gas reduction measures, generally speaking, are listed there. But the other big resource is the, again, World Bank Group EHS guidelines, which talk about the sector-specific measures that we can adopt for the greenhouse gas emission reduction. So I will definitely recommend you to look at it whenever you are looking at a certain project or certain issue, look at the benchmarks, emission factors, and so on. Let's move to pollution prevention, which is another big bucket under the PS3, which is a very important objective. And again, I would like to remind the mitigation hierarchy slide, the focus on avoidance, and as this name of the performance standard 3 includes this word pollution prevention. So of course the prevention or the avoidance is the key. This PS3 provision, which is in number 10 and 11 clauses, applies to the release of pollutants to the air, soil, groundwater, surface water due to routine, non-routine, and accidental events. So this covers all the types of waste and emissions that are coming from the project regularly, occasionally, and accidentally. Again, the idea is to avoid the release of pollutants to the extent possible. So again, let me reiterate, a robust ESIA, a robust baseline study is very important. Consider the existing ambient conditions, as Adriana mentioned, the assimilative capacity of the environment, existing and future land use, cumulative impacts, all this has to be considered as you are actually coming up with your measures to comply with these PS3 requirements, manage your waste and emissions. So of course, avoid to the extent possible, whatever cannot be avoided then has to be managed in alignment with GIIP. One other important element this PS3 talks about is the historical pollution. Many a times our clients are actually looking to acquire the facilities that are already existing. They may come with legacy pollution, land contamination, groundwater pollution. So PS3 requires, as a part of ESIA or as a part of due diligence before you acquire this asset, to conduct an assessment to determine who is responsible for this legacy pollution, cleanup, mitigation of these impacts. So if it is somebody else's responsibility, the previous owner's responsibility, it's also a good commercial sense. Make sure that they clean up and they own that responsibility, the liabilities, if any. If, however, if it is client's responsibility, after we acquire this legacy pollution, then that has to be resolved first as per the national law. And if the national law is silent, then as per the GIIP. Again, which GIIP will depend on the specific situation, what type of pollution, in which location, etc., etc. But this actually defines the principle at a higher level. Lastly, as Adriana mentioned, also look at the specific additional strategies that might be required for projects that are coming up in already degraded areas, degraded airshades. So when you are coming up with pollution mitigation strategies, you have to also look at these additional considerations, which will be, of course, covered in a good PS1 compliant ESIA. And as Adriana mentioned, sometimes we do see challenges that these important issues are not adequately covered. If we go to the next one, we talked about it when we are looking at the waste, all types of hazardous, non-hazardous waste materials, try to avoid to the extent possible, if not reduce, reuse, recover, and recycle, 3 Rs, 4 Rs, 5 Rs, whatever we call this. The important part is also to treat and dispose in an environmentally sound manner. For disposal particularly, try to look at the GIIP alternatives for disposal. And if disposal is very important, is unavoidable, then also look at the local regulations, the GIIP, and if in case there are any other international conventions like Basel Convention is coming into play, if you are sending the waste to another country, we have to also look at all those aspects. Again, a good ESIA will help us in understanding how the wastes are managed right from avoidance to the disposal. And that's where the PS3 provides a high-level guidance and principles in this PS3 number 12. Now, again, let me remind you, the sector-specific issues will be guided by the EHS guidelines that are there, 62 sectors. Also, the ESIA will look at the local specific situation, the assimilative capacity, the availability of technology, and so on. Our EHS guidelines are based on BREF, the European reference documents, best available technology documents. However, as Adriana mentioned, the guidelines are not BAT. They are GIIP. So there is a difference, and we also expect and understand the clients will take time to achieve it over time. So whenever you are designing new facilities, the guidelines should be followed. If you are looking at an existing facility, then we have to look at some site-specific situation, what are the options, how they can achieve the GIIP over the period of time in technically and financially viable manner. Okay, so in terms of disposal, there are a couple of other factors we need to consider. If the waste disposal is done by third parties, let's say biomedical waste from hospitals, or the hazardous waste is sent to the central treatment facilities, it is important for our clients to ensure that those companies are qualified, they have adequate and proper capacity to manage the waste that we are sending to the facilities as per the GIIP. They are managing those facilities, and most importantly, there's a chain of custody. It's not that I send the waste outside my facility, I don't care what's happening. It's very important to verify on an ongoing basis the chain of custody of the waste that's sent to the disposal, make sure it is actually sent, it's properly disposed of, and collect the necessary certification and documentation to make sure that it's done so. In case needed, sometimes you may not have a good centralized facility, then companies or the clients may have to develop their own recovery and disposal facilities, again, aligned with the GIIP. If we extend this discussion to talk about PSP also talks about hazardous materials. We are not only talking about hazardous waste, but there are a lot of hazardous materials that are used in the process, in the production process. And sometimes you inherit hazardous materials in a legacy asset that is acquired, for example, asbestos. So the PS3 provides the guiding principles, and sector-specific guidelines provide more specific nuances. Avoid the use of hazardous materials to the extent possible, but where it is not possible, try to minimize and keep looking for substitution opportunities on an ongoing basis. This includes this assessment, again, focusing on project activities in the ESIA, but cover the entire value chain, if we may say, with transportation, handling, storage, and use of these hazardous materials in the project time. And one important requirement around this is actually to avoid the manufacture, trade, and use of materials that are subject to international bans or phase out. And we'll talk again later about these WHO 1A, 1B banned pesticides in the next part. But also, this is a requirement. Sometimes you have to avoid the use of refrigerants that are being phased out or will be phased out. And that's another important consideration while managing these hazardous materials for this. Yeah, so as I was saying earlier, pesticide use and management, this is a specific requirement, but let me remind you, PS3 talks about pesticide use and management is for the use and not for the production or handling of pesticide. There is a dedicated World Bank Group EHS guideline for pesticide manufacturing, formulation, and packaging. So if IFC or any company is investing, or if you are working with a pesticide manufacturer, then those specific requirements for EHS guidelines will apply. In this case, these PS3 requirements 14 to 17 actually talk about when pesticides are used as a part of the project, let's say in agribusiness or such things, then those are the requirements that apply. So company has to look at integrated pest or vector management. Use of chemicals should be as a last resort. So consider pest control methods that are aligned with cultural practices, biological and genetic methods. So all this has to be considered again as a part of project design or on an ongoing basis. Consideration of toxicity levels for humans and the environment have to be made, especially again as a part of project assessments, impact assessments, any health impact assessments needed while designing these aspects. As mentioned earlier, assess the production, transportation, handling, storage, and use. Look at the entire value chain, but the focus is on, again, integrated pest and vector management, let's say in an agriculture project. Follow the international codes such as, of FAO's International Code of Conduct on the Distribution and Use of Pesticides and other GIIP. And as I was mentioning earlier, there's a clear requirement that there should be no purchase, storage, use, manufacture, and trade of WHO Class 1A or 1B, and very strict controls on use of Class 2 pesticides, Class 2 products. I'd like to now spend a bit of time on, again, sharing some of our experiences, some key issues that we encounter when we are dealing with PS3. I recognize that we have been really rushing through these slides and the topics. In fact, many of the slides, each word on this slide can take one training session. Mitigation hierarchy, what is it and how do we do it in practice? So, but this is again, let me remind, mitigation hierarchy, as I started by saying, is the key for all the PSAs. In this case, it's a focus on pollution prevention, resource efficiency. So that's something we try to see. Clearly, in many cases, we see the projects are driven by local regulation, that you have no choice there is no choice there. You have to follow those. But also at the project design stage, it focuses on resource efficiency. That really adds value, and that's the whole idea of the PS3 objective. Can waste be revenue streams? We are looking increasingly at projects such as plastic recycling, PET bottle recycling, or hazardous waste being used as fuel for cement kilns. So that's quite encouraging, and that's the whole idea, that we have to move towards this more resource efficient, sustainable consumption and production, as we call now, rather than cleaner production. But then we also see some interesting issues, like we are going for resource efficiency, and as Adriana mentioned, resource efficiency is not only energy, it's energy, water, raw materials. And then how do we, sometimes we encounter, we have to make trade-offs. I'll give you an example. We were working on a cement project, and to reduce their GHG footprint, we recommended, the client wanted to set up a waste heat recovery plant. And for that, they had to actually set up the waste heat recovery based power plant, and they were debating whether to have air-cooled condensers or water-cooled condensers. If they use water-cooled condensers, the energy efficiency will be much, much more. If they don't use water-cooled but use air-cooled instead, that would then actually compromise on the energy efficiency. But the project location determined there was no water. There was water shortage. So then we had to take a call that even though it is more energy efficient in this situation, we'll have to do this trade-off and go for air-cooled condenser instead of water-cooled, and at a cost of some percentage efficiency in energy conservation. So it's not always easy, it's not always straightforward, and again, site-specific assessments using ESIs are very important. As we have been talking about, we see that in addition to the local requirements, in addition to specific PS3 requirements, clients also have to look at these additional international agreements, CFC phase out, Montreal Protocol, WHO, and so on. and that also can become a challenge. As we briefly talked about, the EHS guidelines, the benchmarks, resource efficiency ideas, they're all much more feasible for a new facility that is being built in. Okay, we can always do whatever we want. We can even try to do a best compatible, best available technology. But when we have an existing facility, how do we achieve the resource efficiency? Even sometimes we may see a situation where the waste management benchmarks may not be met. You know, the emission levels could be slightly higher than even local requirements, but you are not able to fix the whole air pollution control system overnight. So in those cases, we make sure that a thorough ESI, a thorough assessment is done, and site-specific GIIT targets are developed with a time-bound action plan. Lastly, I think we have to also be mindful about the local capacity in the market. As you know, we all work in very different markets. Each market, especially the frontier markets, where there may not be adequate technical skills, services, technology. Like I used to work a lot in Myanmar, and even to find a good monitoring company who could do, you know, detailed air quality monitoring or a groundwater soil analysis, not easy to find. So those kind of challenges we always face, and we have to find a way out. There's no standard solution. Similarly, we see that there's also a challenge for doing the monitoring this chain of custody when it comes to you know, the PS3 requirement around chain of custody for hazardous waste and management. So these are some of the things that we have seen, and I think we keep seeing different issues, and let's try to see if we have any specific questions and specific issues that our participants are facing. Before that, I'd just like to show that we have a number of PS3 related publications and resources, and these are actually very useful while we are working on projects related to working on the PS3 projects, or all the PSs for that matter. So EHS guidelines is definitely very important, but then there are these other publications, and I guess you are going to receive the links to this. You are going to receive these links separately, and Tigist can share them with you. So I'll stop here, and maybe we can take some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mandar. There are a lot of questions, so they're coming from the different, angles. So, first question: cumulative impacts are difficult to identify when authorities don't share in the radar. How do advise from IFC in other way to do so? How do you advise from IFC in other ways to do so?
Adriana, any views?
Yeah, I think you always have to work with the local authorities as a first hand, but a lot is the communities. So when you do a good assessment and you have connections locally, NGOs, you kind of get the voice of what's going on, and you know kind of, and sometimes people focus only on the local issues or local legislation, but when you take a view maybe of the federal or the country projections, national plans are maybe give you a hint. It's a little bit of a detective work, but you need to do that, and local NGOs, local connections are very useful sometimes to give you the hint on what they are seeing moving. You have to then analyze further to confirm and to verify, but if not, you rather take the precautionary approach and really be thinking what might happen and what are the worst case scenario that you can design for.
Thank you, Adriana. Another question: at the moment, under Paris alignment, we need to consider climate risks and reviewing the resource risks. Are we now incorporating outlook in terms of physical risks?
Maybe it's referring to the risk, for example, of flooding or earthquakes. So if you're referring
change,
to that type of risk, maybe.
Yeah. So I think that. I mean, we are not very prescriptive in the PS3 is very general, covering all the sectors, all the situations. But as I mentioned earlier, yes, I mean, we have to undertake the climate change impact assessment as a part of the ESIA, and all the applicable risks. If I understand correctly, the physical risk, as Adriana mentioned, then yes. So we are actually, if we are looking at developing, let's say, and we actually encountered this. We were looking at a solar project, and we thought the site is not suitable for, or even a cement project, which we thought is very prone to flooding even in normal case, and with the climate change impact is going to get worse. So we do have to look at it and also through the climate change lens, especially going forward.
And maybe to complement on that, there are some sectors that has been identified as more impacted by climate change, and there is an effort to maybe start with some of those to require and to do a deeper analysis on the impacts, and a lot of them, for example, infrastructure, some ports, there are some kind of sectors that that are more sensitive or areas, and then more attention is being paid. And this is very linked now to Performance Standard 1 in the identification of risks and impacts. Specific projects are being required to do a more detailed assessment and screening on the climate change effects, and then tie measures, of course, again, always avoidance and prevention, but also in emergency response plan and what are the actions that need to be taken. Thank you.
Do you implement the PS3 in all type of projects?
Well, yes and no. I mean, the applicability of the PSS is done at the beginning as a part of PS1 assessment. Sometimes we do invest in, let's say, companies like, firstly, financial markets. If we are investing in a bank, it depends on the type of project that we invest. And if, of course, there are waste and emissions, which most of the real sector projects do have. So yes, we do have to apply, but that has to be assessed as a part of the applicability assessment as a part of PS1 assessment.
Right. Not using resource as part of an ESIA was recommend. Is there any success experience, especially with the major resource like fuel, water, electricity?
Not using resource?
Yeah, as part of, isn't it? Yeah, it's phrased a little bit. Not using resource as part of an ESIA was recommend. Is there any success experience, especially with the major resource like fuel, water, electricity?
We always recommend, and we are requiring that the environmental social impact assessment include an analysis on the resource efficiency. Now, there is a priority when the resource is stressed and there is a competition for the use of the resource. But most environmental and social impact assessments are expected to have that. Now, the recommendation is baseline data sometimes when possible. That's a significant gap that we found. And as Mandar pointed out, sometimes the local resources are not there, and sometimes it's hard to do, and it might take longer to identify what is the current level of resource availability. But it is usually principles of baseline data and principles of analysis of alternatives, identifying what are the use of the resource. Cleaner production analysis also are included in to identify what is the use of the resource. So, and the environmental and social impact assessment, unfortunately, sometimes only focus on the biodiversity or other elements and is not taking into account this. Again, don't only focus on energy. There is not a critical view sometimes of the raw materials and the product design And I think now maybe with circular economy and these new trends, there is more attention paid to these things, and it is a requirement. So.
And if I may just add, actually there are several examples, particularly when we look at cement projects. I mean, if we don't completely eliminate, the use of raw materials, but with blended cement, or even with the fuel, trying to move to renewable fuel instead of coal. So there are examples, and as Ajaya mentioned, resource efficiency is not one-off, and we can't really say, oh, we replace completely 100%. It's not always possible, but it's always a journey, and to the extent possible, we do have several such success stories and examples. And also talking about energy usage, IFC, we have this green building certification program called EDGE, which actually helped the companies to reduce, especially the buildings like hotels, hospitals, commercial buildings, to reduce energy and water consumption by significant percentage. So there are many such examples, but the important part is to assess it at the time of ESI or the project assessment and try to apply these measures.
Thank you, Mandar. Is there a discrepancy or inconsistency between the EHS and the PS3? Which one takes preference?
No, there is no discrepancy with the EHS guidelines and PS3. PS3 makes a reference to EHS guidelines as one of the important GIIP element. So there is no discrepancy. And if I may just further add, and I'll let Adriana to also add nuances, PS3 does not give any our World Bank Group EHS guidelines, for example, as you saw, it gives some numerical targets, benchmarks, emission limits, and so on. PS3 does not have that. PS3 are principles that apply to all the sectors, all types of projects. But then the EHS guidelines are what actually go more into granularity at the sectoral level. So I don't see there is any disconnect in that sense. Right, Adriana?
Yeah, that's correct. So it's just a PS3 refer to good international industry practice. One of those is the EHS guideline. The discrepancy happens sometimes is between the local legislation and the EHS guidelines parameters or the good practice guidance. And in that, the requirement is to apply the more stringent one. So you compare the two of them and they say the emissions to effluents at 30 milligrams per liter, and the other one says 50. So you get the more stringent one is the one that will be applicable. But not inconsistency between PS3, because the PS3 is very generic. It applies to any industry. So it's a very hotel to the big cement or fertilizer or oil and gas company. So it's very principle based. Thank you.
Thanks, Adriana. Another question. This person said, our company has more subsidiaries. When referring to the threshold of 25,000 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions, we shall refer to all company emissions or each subsidiary.
So I'll try to respond to that. I think the PSS are written for, and as is applicability section of each PSS say, the PSS are meant to apply for IFC investment and as defined by the scope of IFC investment. So if IFC is investing in one subsidiary, and then as a PS requirement for IFC investment, we will expect the client to do the calculation and monitoring at the subsidiary level. However, in principle, and that's the global trend, and majority of the companies are joining different type of carbon disclosure project. There are climate targets, Paris alignment from the national government, the industry sector, companies' own initiatives. So at some point, of course, it's a good idea to start calculating, start making efforts to monitor the GHG footprint of the entire operation. And as you will see, increasingly, the companies are making commitments to reduce the corporate GHG footprints. Not only that, including their supply chain. So these things are evolving. So the PS3 definition in its strict sense is narrowly defined or narrowly applied to the IFC use of proceeds. When it comes to IFC investment and investment agreement requirements and so on. But in principle, I think we should do everything. And as I said, people are even extending it to their supply chain. So things are evolving.
Yeah, maybe to add quickly, because the requirement is for reporting. So any project needs to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, and that's the guidance. Now, if you have this value, it's about more reporting and constant monitoring, because now you become a significant emitter. But the guidance is always to reduce. Now, internally for your own company, is for your own use, and how you better present these results also to management and to influence change. So it's also for you. I have seen facilities managed at individual level to compare to others, or there is also an aggregate. So how you will use this data is also important on how to monitor. But the 25,000 tons is only for the reporting requirements.
Great. Is there or will there be any requirement to report on Scope 3 emissions?
At the moment, we have the requirement for reporting Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions for those projects, and as projects as been defined by IFC investment scope, that are about 25,000. So at the moment, that's what we have. If we have a revision of PS3 going forward, who knows?
Okay. Is it enough for PS3 compliance if a project hand over hazardous waste to a registered or government certified hazardous waste disposal service provider? Or is it good practice to investigate and document the service provider's disposal chain?
No, as I mentioned, it is not enough as per the PS3 compliance. And it's not just a good practice, it is a requirement that the company has to actually make sure, follow the chain of custody and document that the project, the waste is disposed of in a aligned with GIIP. Now, we know there are challenges, especially in emerging markets, in frontier markets. These things are not always up to the mark, but things are changing. And, we'll, as mentioned earlier, we'll have to make site-specific adjustments, let's say, to comply with this requirement. But PS3 requirement is to actually follow, to make sure that the chain of custody and the contractor is managing the waste in alignment with GIIP and the local regulatory requirements.
Great. How is downstream pollution in the supply chain accounted for in PS3?
So downstream, sorry, what is that?
How is downstream pollution in the supply chain accounted for in PS3?
Do you want to take this, Adriana?
I would say it's not. So the scope of the application of the performance standard 3 is kind of limited to the project that we are financing. Now, there are opportunities where the client can influence pollution in the supply chain, but under the current performance standard 3, I would say there are no specific requirements on supply chain and pollution prevention. Mandar, is that?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see, I'll take one more maybe. Is it clear that this performance standard and other standards are more complete than those contained in the environmental impact studies? Some approach has been established with environmental authorities of each country or adapt or consider the scope of these performance standards. Let's see.
Adriana? Any thoughts? I'm still not very clear about the question.
Yeah, I didn't see the question there. Maybe another question, please.
Okay, let's see. For projects existing A and B, an expansion to A is the cumulative impact on project A or B.
Can you repeat the question, please?
For project existing A and B, an expansion to A is the cumulative impact on project A or B. I'm not sure if that one is clear as well.
I'll try to respond to this, but it's not about impact on A or B. If the project is that of expansion, we want to understand what is the cumulative impact on the receiving environment of the expansion, and if there are any other future projects that are also coming in there. So it's not only about existing project, even if it's a greenfield project coming in an existing area, and there are also likely to have a few more projects coming in, then that's what we try to understand as a part of cumulative impact assessment, which is a part of PS1.
Yeah, nothing
Okay,
to add.
let's
Maybe, Tiki, sorry, there was a couple of questions about pesticides, so I may address one of them. And
sure.
it's talking about that Mandar mentioned pesticides class 1A and 1B are not to be used, but then control for class 2 pesticides. And they are asking what are these controls that are expected. Usually for pesticides management, the control that are expected is the storage, proper storage of those materials, proper labeling and indications, and then the users or the applicators or the workers that are using those pesticides needs to be properly trained, understand what are these pesticides, has access to emergency car sheets, MSTS, and they need to be trained enough to apply the pesticides and then to manage in case of an emergency with the pesticides. So our engineering controls, physical controls about the use of the pesticides. So that's really what it meant with the strict controls, access. You have to know who is accessing the pesticide, clear guidance on how much to apply, what kind of personal protective equipment is being used. So all those are the critical controls to be applied when using pesticides, chemical pesticides. Thank you.
If I may take one more question, if time permits, and this talks about
Sure.
the emission levels regarding wastewater. If an entity is slightly above IFC threshold for POD, COD, but all other parameters are below and all are in line with regulations, when do abatement measures be sufficient and when is wastewater treatment required? I think it's a general question. That's why I wanted to explain how we do it. So firstly, the need for wastewater treatment or any waste management, the treatment requirement will be primarily driven by the legal requirement. Secondly, as mentioned, the ESIA will also identify specific requirements for based on site-specific situation. The assimilative capacity. If you are discharging in a very, very ecologically sensitive area, in a very polluted river or whatever, so then you have to take into account those limits. So whether to require a wastewater treatment plant or not, vis-a-vis IFC guidelines or vis-a-vis local requirements, first it has to be determined by the ESIA studies, baseline studies, and modeling studies. EHS guideline values are guidelines, and that it should be taken as that in that context. And as Adriana mentioned, the local regulations versus IFC standard, whichever is more stringent, we have to apply those. If this is an existing facility and BOD, COD is slightly above IFC threshold, and if it's meeting local standard, and if it is not, adding very significant environmental impacts as can be confirmed through ESIA, then you can make a site-specific call and then decide whether you enforce a wastewater treatment facility now, or you can come up with some other site-specific option. So the point I'm trying to make here is that we should not look at these numbers in isolation and take them as holy grail. We have to look at the big picture, look at the ESI, look at the site-specific situations, look at the local regulations, and then make an informed professional judgment. And that's the crux of PS3. Of course, there are requirements, there are international requirements, bans, and so on. But when it comes to application for at least pollution prevention, waste management aspects, legal compliance, as well as the site-specific environmental conditions, community impacts, health safety impacts, all have to be considered. And that's where actually then the sector-specific EHS guidelines add further nuance and guidance to that.
Great. That will bring us to our last conclusion. I just want to say thank you for everyone joining us in this webinar, and I also want to thank our presenters, Mandar and Adriana. I know most of you are sending whether the material is going to be available. After 1 week, we will share the recording, and the presentation will also be available on our IFC Sustainability website. I just shared a link to evaluation, so please take a couple of minutes to provide us your feedback and this help us to prepare our future sessions. So I want to say, everyone, thank you. Have a great day, great evening, depending where you are. Thank you.